Welcome to the Fourth and Long Fantasy Football Show with Corey and Justin. Here they are, the Fourth and Long Fantasy Brothers.
Welcome into episode 31 of the Fourth and Long Fantasy Football Show and the season finale of the Fourth and Long Fantasy Football Show. My name is Corey, and I am here with my actual brother, Justin.
Hello, this is Justin.
Episode 31, here we come. We're going to do things a little bit different today, as it will be our last show before we take a bit of a holiday break. We'll start with a few key things relevant to Week 16, move on to Justin's fantasy awards for the 2020 season, and then finish up with some reflections on the key takes that we got wrong and right in this fantasy year. We want to keep ourselves honest, and so we will. But let's get things started with some injury quick hits, starting things off with one of the worst injuries we saw, which will definitely impact some finals. Mr. Clyde Edwards-Helaire goes down.
Yeah, he went down with a hip and ankle injury. He's already been ruled out for Week 16 and 17. The hope is that the Chiefs will get him back for the playoffs. Tough blow, but, Le'Veon Bell is really the play here, but I'm not necessarily totally excited. Darrell Williams should mix in as well. It might be a pass-heavy attack here for the Chiefs in Week 16.
What about another guy that's probably on a lot of lists of teams that are going to be making it to the championship week? That's Stefon Diggs, Justin.
Stefon Diggs, another big week here in Week 15 for Diggs. He did have a foot injury, though, towards the end of the game. He exited late in that Saturday game, but McDermott's come out and said he's not all that concerned. We're going to have to monitor reports here over the next few days, and if he can get out on the practice field, I'll feel good about starting in Week 16 here.
We also have some mixed guys like Christian McCaffrey, Joe Mixon, Ronald Jones, Antonio Gibson. What's going on with these guys?
Yeah, so all four of those guys could potentially return for your championship week here. CMC, the expectation is that he'll try to practice Wednesday. Wants to get back out there. It's kind of a lost season here for CMC, but, if you can get back out there, if you made it to the championship with him on your roster, you start him no matter what. Joe Mixon has been on IR for the last number of weeks here. There's rumors that he could potentially come back as well. I don't see it happening necessarily. Rojo, there was actually a shot he could have played Week 15. I fully expect him to play Week 16 here for your championship week. And then Antonio Gibson with the turf toe injury that happened 2 weeks ago. He actually tested it out in practice last week. They did eventually rule him out for Week 15, but there's the shot that he might play Week 16. Not sure if that's the right long-term call from a football team perspective. Long-term longevity for him, but if he's out there, you're playing him.
All right, Justin, sounds good. A lot of stuff to kind of keep in mind as we move into this championship week. Let's talk about what we were talking about in future segments for last week. First off, let's start things off, Justin. You mentioned a few league winners last week, and a lot of them performed quite well, huh?
Yeah, I had four guys on that list: Jonathan Taylor, David Montgomery, Cam Akers, and Brandon Ayuk. Everyone but Cam Akers really performed well. All had touchdowns this week. We'll talk a little bit more about David Montgomery here later on in the show. I'm excited, man, if you got him.
And my future topic was all about George Kittle and his impending return. It almost happened, but it actually did not happen. So there's actually a real chance of that in Week 16, isn't there, Justin?
Yeah, man, if he's out there, you're playing him, right? 50% of George Kittle's better than pretty much every other tight end in the NFL these days.
Yeah, so he could make for an interesting decision for your fantasy championship lineup. Well, with that said, Justin, it's about time for our last show of the season. Let's get to it.
On today's show,
all right, it's the season finale, and we can kick things off by going over some of the major things to be aware of as we are heading into the championship week. I'll get things started, Justin. Point number one that I want to make here is that it's championship week, so do not overthink things at all. Stick with the stars who got you here, unless, of course, you're dealing with injuries. And point number two, I would highly, highly recommend that if you're at this point and you're making decisions possibly in a flex position, it's time to spread out your assets. At this point, it's all luck. Clearly, the top two teams, arguably, just made it into your championship in your league. So your best bet is to make sure your fantasy players are spread out amongst a variety of matchups throughout the weekend. If you've been picking between two flex players, let's say, but one of them is a piece of an offense you already have starters on your fantasy team that you've got linked to, well, consider the other option. I'm not saying to bench studs linked to the same offense. That would be a bad idea, like benching Hill or Kelsey because they're both Chiefs. You start those guys, no questions asked. But if you're between two players, this could be a good rule of thumb to follow. You don't want one bad game flow to ruin your chances at a title. Stacking talent, as it's known, can lead to a major bust in championship weeks. Justin, how about you? Any big takeaways from Week 15 or key bits of advice as we move into Week 16?
Yeah, Corey. So I had a couple things I wanted to talk about. Week 15, week 16, kind of look back, look ahead here. First off, David Montgomery, man, his continued dominance, right? We've talked about him previously. He's actually the first running back with 4 straight games of 24-plus fantasy points this season. That's damn good output right there. And he gets the Jags this week in a pretty juicy championship week matchup. Now, all the hate poured on Monty earlier this season. He has a shot to finish top 5, man, at the running back position. I told you all to buy. I hope you did. The other thing I want to talk about was the Steelers' offense. Ooh, man, dismal performance against the Bengals on Monday Night Football. It's hard not to worry about guys like Claypool, Juju, and Big Ben going into Week 16, right? I mean, if I have equal options here, I might zig in a championship week from the Steelers, who kind of look lost here, man, on offense. Calvin Ridley is damn good. I mean, in his 5 games without Julio Jones this season, he's averaging either 100 yards and a touchdown. Corey, you had the call earlier on in the season that Julio Jones would be outside of the top 20, and that's looking even better now. I think Ridley's a bona fide wide receiver 1 here at this point. The last thing I wanted to talk about was grabbing your handcuffs, right? We talked about that a few weeks ago, and looky here, man, Tony Pollard came through big time in Week 15 for his fantasy managers. He actually scored more fantasy points than Ezekiel Elliott has scored in his last 2 seasons. Wow. Now, Pollard has the highest rate of missed tackles forced per attempt since 2019. He's actually ahead of Nick Chubb. If you're a Zeke owner, man, I hope you had Pollard, who could be a league winner here.
Yeah, Justin, all great points, all awesome things that you are summing up there as we look into Week 16 and beyond. All right, now it's time to do a quick reflection of the fantasy season and discuss who should take home the prizes for guys who both won and lost your fantasy seasons. Justin, let's start things off. Who is your fantasy rookie of the year?
Yeah, so my fantasy rookie of the year is going to be, and this was tough because the class is crazy good this year, but my fantasy rookie of the year is going to be James Robinson, the Jacksonville running back. And like I said, man, wow, what a rookie class. I mean, this could be the best we've ever seen. It could be the best we'll ever see. And, you know, yes, we've had guys emerge late this season, the likes of Jonathan Taylor, Brandon Ayuk, Cam Akers, Antonio Gibson, but with all the talent, man, the 2020 fantasy rookie of the year is a 3-horse race in my mind. And it was between Justin Herbert, Justin Jefferson, and James Robinson. And like I said, I'm gonna go with James Robinson here. And I'm not just looking at his production, but what it costs to secure his services here in 2020, man. The guy was a waiver wire option coming into the season. He was free. And as we sit here today going into Week 16, he has 1,400 plus total yards. He's got 10 touchdowns. He was a rock-solid RB1 all season, man. This guy's arrow is pointing straight up, and if the Jaguars can bring in Trevor Lawrence here in 2021, this offense has the potential to be great for years.
Yeah, I can't agree with you more there, Justin. James Robinson was really, really a great cream that rise to the top in Jacksonville, and I really hope we see many more years of his really sort of power style running, but with a little more juice in him. He's definitely a more impressive runner than some of your traditional power backs. I look forward to seeing what type of utility he gets in future years. A great rookie season, though, especially from a fantasy perspective. All right, Justin, let's move things a little bit and let's talk about a little bit of a down. Who was your fantasy bust or LVP, least valuable player of the 2020 season?
Yeah, my fantasy bust LVP for this year is going to be Philadelphia quarterback Carson Wentz. Man, it was ugly in 2020 for Carson Wentz. He was, top 10 quarterback last year in fantasy circles. He was being drafted right around that 10 to 12 range this year. It was ugly. He led the league in turnovers, sacks allowed. He just looked completely lost in what most of us thought would be a rebound 2020 campaign for the young quarterback. And up until 2 weeks ago, man, we thought it was the team as a whole, right? We kind of looked at the Eagles. We looked at their game plan, their offensive scheme, and we're kind of shaking our heads, but, look at what Jalen Hurts has been able to do with the weapons at his disposal for the Eagles, right? I mean, he's really turned this offense around. He's turned the Eagles season around a bit too late in my mind. Now, I don't see a world where Wentz is the starter for the Eagles in 2021. He has to be the fantasy football LVP for 2020, and I wouldn't be shocked to see him in a different uniform in 2021, whether it's with the Patriots, the 49ers, the Colts, hell, maybe even the Jets.
Justin, I have to say, I agree with you with Carson Wentz being the fantasy LVP sort of long term. But I will say in the short term, just for this 2020 season, I'm a little surprised I didn't hear the name Ezekiel Elliott come out of your mouth. Was pretty much healthy for the entire season other than this past week and was really, really a big disappointment for a lot of fantasy owners who took him in the first round. I don't disagree with Carson Wentz, but I just want to make a little plug for Zeke Elliott there, Justin. What do you think about that?
Yeah, it's a good call. You have to wonder if his season would have been the same, though, if it wasn't for, Dak Prescott going down, right? He was a top 10 running back before Prescott got injured, and it was just a series of unfortunate events for Zeke Elliott here with his offense and the philosophy there. And, another honorable mention, Corey, that I actually thought about here for LVP was Hollywood Brown. You and I both were pretty high on him coming into the season, and until this past week, he was outside the top 40 at the wide receiver position.
Yeah, great point there. That's another wonderful example. Well, Justin, if Carson Wentz is going to rebound, hopefully he'll be able to attain this next award. It's our Fantasy Comeback Player of the Year.
Yeah, my Fantasy Comeback Player of the Year is going to be Aaron Rodgers, the Green Bay quarterback. And now, obviously, the real life award here, right? The NFL Comeback Player of the Year award should go to Alex Smith for obvious reasons. But for fantasy purposes, I'm going to go with Aaron Rodgers as the Comeback Player of the Year. Now, yes, he wasn't hurt last year, right? He was still top 10 at the position, but he's really, quote unquote, come back into that elite tier of fantasy quarterbacks, and he should be drafted in the top 5 at the position in 2021. I think the drafting of Jordan Love by the Packers really energized Rodgers this season. Rodgers has a lot of young weapons, right? He's got Devontae Adams, Lazard, MBS. He's got the emergence of Tanya at the tight end position, and he's got a young trio of talented backs in Jones, Williams, and Dillon. Hopefully Jones re-signs here, but after finishing the season last year just inside the top 10, Rodgers has really reestablished himself as a cornerstone fantasy quarterback with upside to be the highest scoring quarterback week in and week out. He'll pretty comfortably be in my top 5 at the position for 2021.
Justin, Aaron Rodgers is an awesome pick there, and establishing back as an elite quarterback is definitely worth the Comeback Player of the Year. Quick shout out to Adam Thielen, who I know plays a close second in this category, a guy that we may be talking about again very soon in an upcoming segment. But let's finish things up, Justin, with the big one. Who is this year's 2020 Fantasy MVP? We both got this wrong. We both predicted this incorrectly. But without a doubt, this man stood above the rest.
Yeah, I think before the season started, Corey, you and I had Zeke Elliott and Saquon Barkley as our fantasy MVPs. And situation and injuries definitely played a role in the outcome there. And in my mind, the fantasy football MVP for this season was really a 4-horse race. It was between Dalvin Cook, Derrick Henry, Alvin Kamara, and Tyreek Hill. And I'm going to go with Dalvin Cook as our fantasy MVP for this year. He missed just one game in week 6, but he still has managed over 1,800 total yards. He's at 18 touchdowns. This guy's the definition, man, of a fantasy football cornerstone back. I give him the edge over Derrick Henry because of his usage in the passing game and because he's had more consistent outputs week in and week out. Now, Dalvin's going to be in the discussion for number 1 pick here in 2021, and I wouldn't scoff at anyone who took him over the likes of CMC, Henry, or Kamara.
Couldn't agree more, Justin. That man performed for you throughout most of the fantasy football season and won a lot of people a lot of money this year and hopefully have gotten people into their fantasy championships. Now, Justin, it's time. It's time for a quick reflection of keeping ourselves in check. Let's discuss what we predicted wrong and why we think things went wrong and what we predicted correctly and what we saw to make that happen. It's our segment of keeping ourselves in check and checking in with how our predictions from earlier on panned out. I'm going to get things started. I want to start with a positive, Justin. I want to start with a pat on the back, and that was a guy you've already mentioned, Aaron Rodgers. Now, I ranked this guy in the top 6 quarterbacks at the beginning of the season. Go back and check it, and thought it was madness that others were not doing that. I'm really happy about this one because this is where the fantasy community constantly trips up. He's still great. The talent's still great, and he'll be a top 6 quarterback next year as well, like he should be. The next call I got right is a little bit on the negative side, but it was Mark Andrews. Now, I predicted that for the start of the 2021 season, so next season, he won't be a top 5 tight end, and I think that should be true. Maybe he'll be a fringe guy, but I bet we're going to see him closer to the 8 to 10 range. Everything I projected in this situation came to fruition. He's not a Kelsey Kittle. He has a poor thrower for a quarterback, and I was staying away, and I think I'm glad I did. Next up, Justin, is Austin Eckler. This guy was probably my biggest projected bust because I said he would be out of the top 30 next year, and I think I got this wrong in terms of running backs. He will be lower than he was this past year, but this has to be considered a miss for me. He clearly makes the Chargers offense better and will most likely be a PPR top 20 guy, even if the Chargers bring in a better in-between-the-tackles option to go with him. I just missed on this one, Justin, and I stand true that he's not a superstar and he's not super special, But what he does very well, and that's going to sustain some fantasy value. Another guy I got really wrong was Devin Singletary. This is another running back miss for me, but I don't feel like this one pains me quite as much. He clearly still shows some nice contact balance and movement. His offense just completely changed on him this year. He was not startable by the end of the season, which is not how I had him ranked, nor what I predicted at the start of the season. You also can't dismiss Zach Moss's impact, which I definitely underplayed. I'm much more wary of him going into next year, but you'll probably see me taking some late round flyers with him because predicting the Bills will be the exact same as next year is going to be a mistake. And I expect the fantasy community will make that mistake, and I'm going to take advantage. Let's end with some positives. First positive is Mr. Adam Thielen. The end of the season tells a different story, but the high points were exactly what I expected. I had him ranked as a top 10 wide receiver, and I proved myself right. I won't be as giddy on him next year as Jefferson's emergence cannot be understated, but his comeback year was great for anyone who wrote him as their wide receiver too, especially in PPR leagues. My last guy that I want to talk about is really close to my heart, and you know it very well, Justin. It's Mr. Ronald Jones. Boy, it wasn't always pretty, but it sure was pretty darn effective. Rojo is a big reason I made the playoffs in every league I was a part of this year. What started as a frustrating committee eventually turned into a pretty satisfying role. I understand if you were reluctant to start him throughout the season, but by the end, he had won me more weeks than he had lost. For an 8th or 9th round guy, he was a rock-solid RB2 who produced RB1 weeks time and time again. This is not a full victory lap. I'm going to temper myself a little bit here, but it's a nice victory jog for me, Justin. Only 3 weeks where he killed you, which is what you expect in a consistent RB2. But he had 9 great weeks where he could have been your set it and forget it RB2, winning you weeks while you were able to sustain a nice wide receiver core. For a guy you could almost get in the double-digit rounds, that's something worth smiling over. Justin, those were my big calls for the year. A lot of hits, a few big misses. How about yourself?
Yeah, a lot of the same over here, man, for me, right? I mean, fantasy football is so hard to predict between injuries, coaching changes, and the other variables like, weather, for instance. It's not a perfect science, right? But it's important to acknowledge when we've made bad calls and we've made really good calls. So I'll start with the bad first, and I'll start with the Lions backfield. I really didn't make a great call on that one. I called DeAndre Swift a bust and Kerryon Johnson a player to own in 2020, and man, was I wrong on both fronts. I mean, Kerryon Johnson barely saw the field, and Swift looks like the real deal. Now, you have to wonder, right, is this a bad assessment or just a situation where the opportunity was not there? And I'd say it's a combination of both. Now, Swift looks good. I'll admit it, right? I was wrong on that. But Kerryon Johnson just hasn't gotten the chance to be the back I think he can be. We'll have to see what happens, man, as the years unfold here for Kerryon Johnson. I was also wrong on A.J. Brown. The guy continues to dominate as a clear-cut wide receiver 1 for the Tennessee Titans. I expected regression, right? A lot of experts out there were calling for regression here in A.J. Brown's historic rookie season, and I expected him to perform more like a low-end wide receiver 2, but he's just too big and too strong, man. I've seen it in back-to-back years. He'll be a low-end wide receiver 1 for me next season. Now the good, I did predict some breakout seasons from guys like Antonio Gibson and David Montgomery. Both were guys that were going super late in drafts in late August and have now either gotten you to the championship or will win you a championship. And I'm excited for what these guys can do in 2021. I was also super high on Stefon Diggs performing as a wide receiver 1, and boy, Corey, you and I were both right on that one, man. He's sitting just outside the top 5 in standard scoring. He's top 3 in PPR. He's a bona fide stud, man, and he should be one of the first wide receivers drafted in 2021. Now, Corey, before we wrap up here, I just wanted to thank all of our listeners and supporters for a great first season of the Fourth and Long Fantasy Football Show. I've had a lot of fun doing this, man. It's been a great experience, a lot of fun, and we're going nowhere. And we really look forward to bringing you guys content over the offseason as we get you prepared for 2021.
Justin, you could not be more correct. And there we go. It's the 2020 season, and it is in the books, the inaugural season of the Fourth and Long Fantasy Football Show. Please keep an eye out as we enter the new year, where Justin and I will be doing independent film review sessions on some of the players who intrigue us going into the 2021 fantasy season, because it's already time to start thinking about that. Remember, as always, to subscribe and hit the bell, download, follow, like, comment, whatever else you have to do to show some support. I am Corey.
And I'm Justin.
And this has been the Fourth and Long Fantasy Football Show. We'll see you in 2021, everybody.
Royalty-free music courtesy of Ben Sound. The views and opinions expressed on today's episode are that of the Fourth and Long Fantasy Football Show. Remember to like and subscribe.